Hi there, my name is Aubrey and I'm an opera singer and a voice coach. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about this Instagram account that I found, and I was really interested by it because it has a series of posts that are essentially different quotes from various singers and composers. And when I was reading through them, I was kind of shocked at the strength of some of the language being used, because I do feel that there are many people I've met who hold these similar beliefs, even though a lot of us in the sphere might not agree with it. So even though some of these quotes I really struggled to validate, I can't be sure that all of them were actually attributed to who they say it was attributed to, but I think that the overall sentiment of a lot of these phrases are things that are still relevant conversations to be had today. So I'm just going to use these posts as a springboard for us to have these kinds of discussions. So I just wanted to preface this by saying that I can't really speak to the validity of these quotes, but the overall sentiment is something that I've definitely heard other people say, and so we might as well discuss it anyways. The first quote I have is attributed to Elena Obretsova, and like I said, I'm not entirely sure if she actually said this, but it's something that I've definitely heard pop up in different circles. I believe that what is happening in opera now is a crime against opera. It is like adding some random details to classical paintings. It is barbaric. If someone wants to modernize, let them write a contemporary opera and stage it as they wish. All of this comes from incompetence and lack of culture. Whew, that is some pretty aggressive language there. And when I first read it, it definitely came across as extremely dismissive and also minimizing of the efforts being done by modern opera. The idea that modernizing opera is coming from incompetence and a lack of culture is a really strong statement. I don't believe that it's barbaric to want to reinterpret music that's a few centuries old to better suit discussions that are happening in modernity. I also don't think that comes from people being incompetent or people lacking culture. In fact, I think it's quite the opposite. I feel like a lot of modernization is very highly educated people wanting to relate these pieces that they love so dearly and have spent so much time studying in a new way. And I think that we can do this with modernization, as well as we can do with historically informed performances. I think quotes like this really try to create a binary in opera, which is that it's either historically informed or it's contemporary. There can be no middle ground. There can be no crossover, no combination, no changes being made. And this goes back to conversations I've had with many of my colleagues and friends about the museumification of opera and what that's done to our relationship to the audience. I think views like this more so reflect this idea that opera is for the artists on the stage or the directors more so than opera is for the audience. And by creating that separation between us and the audience, it does make it hard for the audience to sometimes feel welcome into the space. Because if you have to have a certain level of education or cultural awareness or whatever it is, then you might not feel like you belong in the audience. Quotes like this reinforce a lot of older fashioned viewpoints where we should be really, really honing in on this elitist viewpoint, this it's for us, not for everyone kind of thing, and that if you don't understand it, that you just don't belong here. I think that just isn't necessarily going to help us survive as an art form. I think it's going to continue to cause the numbers in attendance to decline. So another quote that was related to Elena Obretsova is, "In many theaters, there are all sorts of modern gimmicks, but I believe this comes from ignorance and mediocrity." Another moment quoting on this negative viewpoint that anyone trying something new is just dumb or not talented. And I think, again, this is really hurtful to a lot of people who are experimental or creative, because there is no reason to assume that people are not intelligent or not capable of doing this high level of art. It's that they often see it, they learn how to do it, and then want to push those boundaries. I think that that's something that's worthy of being celebrated rather than dismissed or belittled. But I do see a lot of people condemning things like quote unquote gimmicks and saying that this desire for shock value just to get butts in seats is something that we should turn away from. And to a point, sure, I do believe that throwing everything in the kitchen sink at the audience isn't necessarily going to attract people any more than us being super rigid and elitist. But I do think that there's a space for us to embrace fun and whimsy and excitement, because that's part of the reason why we go to the theater, is to experience the suspension of disbelief, to really explore a world that's beyond our own. And by creating the same performance over and over again, perhaps just changing out the singers, maybe changing up the costumes slightly, but maintaining a majority of the same exact situation, say the staging looks similar, the background looks similar, everything looks similar, you're going to see it once or twice and then know you don't need to see it again. Whereas if we play around with the way these performances are actually vehicles for different discussions or different modern takes or even different styles of performance, we can use it as an opportunity to connect with newer and newer audiences. The last quote that I have from Elena Obretsova is, "Back in our day, people also started engaging in such nonsense. But we simply refused to sing. I arrived in Italy, and Escamillo, the toreador from Bizet's Carmen, came out in just red underwear. He pretended he was a boxer. I said, 'Thank you, goodbye,' and left." And again, it's this very uppity vibe that makes people who might not know that much about opera feel uncomfortable. Hearing people make statements like this, whether Elena Obretsova actually said this or not, because even if it's not her, I've definitely heard people take very, very, very similar subjects and say similar things about it. I just can't help but see this viewpoint as exclusionary. I really struggle to come up with ways where I would want, as an artist, to prevent people from seeing my performances. It makes me feel like a lot of these singers who hold these viewpoints don't really care about why they're singing. They really feel like it's so personal that it doesn't matter if the audience is connected or not to what I'm doing. They should just feel grateful that I'm performing for them at all. And that, to me, doesn't really connect with why I sing. I personally prefer to create an environment where my audience feels connected to me and connected to the music that I'm giving them. And sometimes that means taking risks or doing something that I might not have originally thought was going to be what I do, but by working collaboratively with other artists or directors, sometimes we come up with really cool ideas that are totally new and different and fresh, which to me is exciting. And as an audience member, right, if I turn my singer brain off and I think of myself as an audience member for a moment, I like seeing those things. I didn't grow up around a lot of opera. I don't come from a background where opera was performed all the time, or I even really ever saw anything as a kid. So for me, I do find myself leaning towards these more creative interpretations and less historically informed performances. Now, that being said, that does not mean I never want to go see a traditional setting of an opera. Quite the opposite. I really enjoy both. I feel like there's space for both because I personally want to see both. Most people I know also want to see both. There is absolutely no reason to assume that there is a finite amount of interest in any one kind of opera. There is no limit to the amount of interest that audience members have. It's about whether or not you figure out what these interests are and can program them in an appropriate manner. I don't feel like it would be a crazy thing for me to say that most people would love to see a modernization that's really creative. For example, there was an amazingly cool multimedia performance of Die Zauberflöte from Komische Oper Berlin, and it was so fun and different and fresh. It really leaned into those absurdist, surrealist images that the magic flute tries to discuss, and I thought it worked great. It was completely different than what Mozart probably imagined, but I don't think it took away from anything. In fact, it really brought to life something I have heard and seen many, many times in a very similar format in the past. That being said, I also saw a very, very traditional format of Così fan tutti, and it was absolutely adorable, and it was so much fun to see all these historically informed costumes and such beautiful, traditional, luxurious backdrops. I like both. Why can't it be okay for us to do both? I do feel like a lot of these opinions that I see floating around just come from a place of I'm special and I want to maintain what makes me special at the expense of not inviting other people who might have other viewpoints into this discussion. And I think that this also comes down to the fact that a lot of people believe that the only real artists are the composer and the librettist. That, to me, is a very limiting viewpoint. If you don't believe that the director, that the orchestra, that the singers on stage, that the people who design the backdrops, that the people who provide more contextualization through coachings are not also creators of an opera, then why are we doing them anymore? Why don't we just perform it one time perfectly, exactly how people like Rossini wanted it, and then never touch it again? I think if we only believe that the people who wrote the actual music are the only ones who have any say in how things are performed, then you might as well just stop re-performing it over and over again, because there's going to be a point where that original composer perhaps believes that's the best version that's ever existed. I think that we are more than just what one or two people define us to be. I think we can be anything we do want. I think pushing the boundaries of opera is what is so exciting. And perhaps these bigger houses don't feel as comfortable pushing the envelope because they do have limitations like donors and such. But I am so excited and heartened by the increase in smaller houses and black box theaters kind of playing again. And like I said earlier, introducing this whimsy back to opera. I think that if we are to move forward, there is one major step we need to take as artists collectively, which is to stop taking ourselves quite so seriously. I think we have just sanitized it so much, academified it, museumified it, deified it so much that we don't really have as much space as we deserve to create something really unique and special. I think that by being so rigid in our understanding of what opera should and could be, we have kind of poured water on a lot of great singers' sparks. I think we should be focusing more on sharing those tools to love opera than keeping people who don't inherently have those tools already from a young age from our audience. This is just like my unscripted opinion based on a handful of quotes I saw on an Instagram post. I'd also really love to hear the kinds of things that you've heard about opera. There's so many strong opinions in this field, and they range from let's break it all down and start all over and do something completely different to let's maintain it exactly how it was always done 200 years ago and never, ever, ever break from that tradition. And if we do, it's sacrilegious. I just think that there's so many opinions between those two. And I think that's also what makes us great, even if it does cause some conflict sometimes. So I would love to hear your opinions, and thank you so much for spending this time with me. And remember, always to keep on singing.